So they say a home remembers every breath, every secret, every betrayal, and my lake house, with its cedar walls and glass windows spilling light into the water, remembers the night I learned I was no longer its rightful keeper, at least in the eyes of my parents. It was late summer, the air thick with the perfume of pine and damp earth, when my sister arrived like a queen without a crown, her voice ringing with the easy entitlement she wore like perfume. "They told me I can move in," she said, dropping her bags onto the oak floor as if the deed were already in her name. My heart sank, but not with disbelief. I had known this family storm was gathering for years, brewing in whispers and glances, in the way my parents praised her and tolerated me, still hearing it aloud, that my parents had promised her my $515,000 sanctuary, the house I had bled and bent my life to buy. Felt like someone was stripping the shingles off the roof in the middle of a storm. I asked her where she got such an idea, and she smiled, a slow, infuriating smile. "Mom and Dad. They said it's only fair I get the lake house since you already have your career." Fair. That word cut deeper than any blade. And just like that, I realized this wasn't just about a house. It was about erasure, about rewriting the story of my sacrifice, so my sister could star in a life I built. That night, as the water outside lapped against the rocks, I made a vow, not out loud, not in rage, but deep in the marrow of my bones. They thought they could gift away my blood, sweat, and years. They thought wrong. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house, a white two-story home that smelled of lilacs and lemon polish. The place that had once been my anchor but now felt like a courtroom. I walked in without knocking, old habits die hard, and found them sitting at the dining table, sunlight splintering through the blinds, dust motes suspended in the still air like tiny witnesses. My father cleared his throat as though he'd been rehearsing a verdict, while my mother fiddled with her teacup, avoiding my eyes. I didn't sit. I just stood there, heart hammering, words pressing against my teeth. Finally, I asked the question that had been slicing me open all night. "Why did you promise my sister my lake house?" My mother sighed, the kind of sigh meant to sound wary, but really dripped with rehearsed martyrdom. "Would just thought it would be nice," she said softly, as if she were offering me a slice of cake instead of slicing apart my life. My father leaned forward, his voice heavy with authority. "You already have enough, and your sister has struggled. Don't be selfish." Selfish, that word rattled in my skull like a loose nail in the wind. Selfish, after years of working double shifts, after saving every penny, after buying that lake house not as luxury but as survival, as proof that I mattered. My vision blurred, rage and heartbreak tangling until I couldn't tell one from the other. "You don't get to give away what isn't yours," I snapped, my voice colder than the lake in December. For a moment, silence reigned, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock. My mother's lips trembled, but not with guilt, with disdain. "You're being cruel," she whispered, standing in the way of family, and in that instant, something in me cracked wide open. I saw the storm for what it was, not a squall I could weather, but a battle I would have to fight. That night, I drove back to the lake house, headlights slicing through the dark forest roads, my chest burning with the echo of that one word, cruel. Cruel for saying no to a theft disguised as generosity. Cruel for protecting what I had built with my own two hands. The lake lay still as glass when I arrived, the moon stretched across its surface like a silver scar. I stood on the deck, staring at the rippling reflection of my home, and I made a decision that felt less like choice and more like destiny. No one, not my parents, not my sister, not anyone, would take this place from me. I started by locking every door, every window, changing codes and passkeys like a general fortifying a castle before siege. I could almost hear my father scoffing, my mother sighing, my sister laughing at the audacity of my defiance, but as I turned each key, bolted each lock, I felt something shift inside me. This house was more than wood and stone. It was my story, every overtime hour, every missed holiday, every sacrifice embodied in its beams. To surrender it would be to erase myself. And yet, I knew my family wasn't finished. They had tested me with words, next would come pressure, manipulation, and guilt sharper than any blade. They would call. They would visit. They would twist the story until neighbors whispered and relatives judged. They would make me the villain in their version of events. But for the first time in years I felt ready. Because villains, after all, don't just endure storms, they learn how to wield them. The calls began within days. First, my mother's voice, trembling with weaponized sorrow. "Your sister already told her friends she's moving in. Do you really want to humiliate her like that?" Then my father's tone, sharp and accusing, each word a gavel pounding against my chest. "We raised you. We sacrificed for you. And this is how you repay us. My sister, of course, skipped pretense altogether. Her message came in the form of a text, 5 blunt words that dripped with entitlement. This house is mine now. I stared at the screen until my vision blurred, until rage crawled up my throat like bile. But I didn't answer. Not yet. Because I knew something they didn't. I wasn't cornered. They thought they held the power of guilt, of family pressure, of reputation. What they forgot was that the deed to this house had my name, and only my name, printed in black ink. And beyond the ink was something fiercer, my will. Still, the weight of their accusations pressed on me like chains. Cruel, selfish, ungrateful, each word thrown like stones, each meant to shatter the glass walls of my sanctuary. And maybe, just maybe, a part of me almost believed them. Until one evening, sitting in the dim glow of the lakehouse fireplace, I remembered the years they'd dismissed me, the way they'd praised my sister's every stumble while mocking my every step. Suddenly, it became clear this wasn't about generosity, or fairness, or family. It was about control. They wanted my house because they wanted to remind me I'd never really own anything. Not even my own success. That realization lit a fuse inside me. If they wanted war, I'd stop waiting for their verdict. I'd deliver mine first. I started quietly, like a craftsman sketching blueprints for a cathedral no one believed he could build. While my parents schemed and my sister boasted, I gathered receipts, contracts, tax documents, every scrap of proof that the lake house was mine alone. I called my lawyer, a man with a voice like gravel and patience like stone, and laid it all out. They can pressure me, shame me, curse me. I told him. But they can't take what I bled to earn. He chuckled, low and knowing. If they try, it won't be you who looks cruel. That night I drafted a letter, not one of sentiment but of law, a formal notice, signed and sealed, that no one but me had the right to inhabit or lay claim to this house. Cold, clinical, ironclad. But it wasn't enough. Legal walls could protect the deed, but they couldn't expose the rot that had been spreading through my family for years. No, I wanted something more poetic. Something that would unravel their illusion of control in front of the very audience they hoped to impress. And so, I began inviting relatives and neighbors to the lake house for a gathering. Just a little family celebration, I said smoothly, to honor the years of sacrifice that made this home possible. My parents agreed eagerly, my sister smirking in anticipation, believing it was the coronation she had been promised. What they didn't know was that I had prepared more than hors d'oeuvres and drinks. I had prepared the truth, sharpened like a blade, waiting for the perfect moment to cut their false narrative wide open. The day of the gathering arrived like a forecasted storm, bright, unbearable, and inevitable, and the house thrummed with an energy that felt part celebration, part ambush. I watched them arrive through the tall windows, my parents smiling with the practiced ease of people who believe they already own the narrative, my sister gliding in as though stepping onto a stage she expected applause for, cousins and neighbors trailing behind with curious faces and polite smiles. I had set the table with care linen napkins, the china my grandmother once used, glasses that caught the light and fractured it into 1,000 tiny accusations, and in the center of it all I placed a stack of envelopes, plain, unassuming, like seeds, each one bearing a name and an address. The room filled with small talk, laughter that smelled faintly of obligation, and then, when the appetizers had barely been touched and the wine glasses were halfway to empty, I stood. Silence folded itself around the room. Even the lake seemed to hush in anticipation. I didn't begin with rage or fireworks. I began with a story, the kind you tell into a microphone and watch shape people's faces into comprehension. I spoke of the first winter I stayed up patching the roof, the nights I worked a second job to pay the mortgage, the way the house held me when the rest of the world failed. Little intimate confessions that made their mouths tighten and their eyes shift. Then I let the law in the deed, the receipts, the letter from my lawyer. I handed an envelope to my mother, and asked her to read aloud the line that named me the sole owner. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the paper. She read with the same voice she used to read bedtime stories, but this time her words landed like stones. My sister's smile faltered. The room split into currents, those who looked embarrassed, those who looked shocked, and those who looked betrayed on behalf of a narrative they'd been fed. I watched charity crumble from my parents' faces, the way privilege erodes when the stage lights are stripped away. Then, not satisfied with the paper trail, I played a recording, a string of voicemails and messages where my parents casually negotiated the transfer of the house as if it were a trinket, a petty bargaining chip in the family's ledger. The air grew electric, someone gasped, someone cursed, and my sister, who had rehearsed her future for months, stared at the floor with the sort of terror you see in people who realize they were living in someone else's script. It was not just the facts that humbled them, but the performance of those facts, the slow, deliberate unveiling of every slight and every omission that had been used to rewrite my history. For the first time in a long while, I felt pity, a cold pity that sat next to my rage, and when I spoke again it was softer, but no less decisive. This house is mine. Your promises don't overwrite my life. They tried to recover, apologies like flurries, explanations like smokescreens, but the neighbors had already started to cross-examine, cousins whispered about reputation, and my parents' authority thinned like old paint under heat. The gathering dissolved not into the reconciliation they'd imagined but into a reckoning. The house, finally, had become more than my shelter. It had become a mirror held up to everyone who had ever tried to erase me. After the gathering, my parents left in a silence so sharp it felt like glass breaking underfoot, their faces pale with the kind of humiliation that lingers long after the guests go home. My sister stormed out last, heels striking the wooden deck like war drums, but even her fury sounded hollow, rehearsed, a tantrum that had lost its audience. For weeks afterward, the phone stayed quiet, no calls, no apologies, no attempts at reconciliation, only silence, thick and deliberate, their absence now a weapon wielded against me. I should have felt abandoned, but instead I felt something I hadn't known in years: peace. The lake stretched wide and still, the air clean of accusations, the house mine in more than paper and brick. It was mine in spirit, untouchable. Yet silence has a way of becoming a stage too, and word of the Lakehouse showdown, as some cousins started calling it, rippled through the family tree like fire catching dry leaves. I became both villain and hero depending on the teller, my refusal painted as cruelty in one breath and courage in the next. At first, I bristled, but then I realized this was the sweetest justice. They had tried to gift away my sanctuary to my sister and paint me ungrateful, but instead their own voices had revealed them as manipulative and entitled. They had exiled themselves. Every time a neighbor waved and said, "Good for you, standing your ground," I felt the roots of the house dig deeper into me, like the land itself was rewarding me for saying no. The revenge was no longer about confrontation. It was about endurance, about watching them wither in the cold exile of their own making. They wanted me to feel alone. Instead, they ended up alone themselves, swallowed by the silence they'd created. Silence never lasts forever, not with people who thrive on control. One evening, just as the lake blushed with sunset, I heard tires crunching on the gravel drive. My sister's car appeared, red and impatient, like a warning flare in the dusk. She stepped out in designer heels that had no business on lakeside earth, her face painted in fury and desperation. "You can't do this," she hissed the moment I opened the door, her voice trembling not from fear, but from entitlement unraveling. "They promised me this house. Everyone knows it. If you had a shred of decency, you'd hand it over." I leaned against the doorframe, the weight of her words falling harmlessly against me now, like arrows blunted against armor. "Promised." I repeated, my voice low, steady, cinematic. "But they can't promise what isn't theirs." She stepped closer, her perfume cloying, her eyes sharp. "If you don't give it up, I'll make sure everyone knows how heartless you are. I'll ruin you." I almost laughed. Ruin me. My reputation had already survived their lies, their whispers, their accusations. What did she have left? But then she tried her final card: tears, the kind that once worked on teachers, boyfriends, even my parents. Her mascara streaked, her voice broke, and she whispered, "I just wanted something of my own." For a moment, I almost saw her, not as a rival, but as the spoiled child our parents had sculpted, someone who had never learned to build, only to demand. But pity is not the same as surrender. I handed her an envelope, the same kind I'd given out at the gathering. Inside was not another deed, but a photocopy of every unpaid debt she had racked up over the years, records I had quietly gathered, credit cards maxed, loans ignored, promises broken. "This is yours," I said, my voice like the lake in winter, icy, unmovable. "You want something of your own? Start with your debts. Earn your life the way I earned mine." She stared at the papers, her face draining of color, the performance gone, the mask cracked. Without another word she turned and stormed back to her car. The engine roared, tires spit gravel, and she vanished down the road. But this time I didn't feel shaken. I felt victorious. Because revenge wasn't always about taking something, it was about handing someone the mirror they'd been running from their whole life. It was weeks after my sister's outburst when the knock finally came. A slow, heavy rhythm on the Lakehouse door, like judgment itself had arrived. I opened it to find my parents standing there, shoulders slumped, their practiced authority stripped away, looking smaller than I had ever seen them. My father, once thunderous in his certainty, couldn't meet my eyes. My mother clutched her purse like a shield, her lips pressed tight as though holding back words that had lost their power. They didn't ask to come in, but I stepped aside anyway, letting them into the house they had once tried to gift away. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the ticking of the clock and the faint lap of the lake outside. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice fragile, stripped of pretense. "We thought we were helping her. We thought you'd understand." I studied her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the old sting of guilt. I felt clarity. "Helping her," I said slowly, "men erasing me. You didn't see me, not when I was working myself raw to buy this place, not when I kept it alive through every storm. You only saw what you could take." My father shifted, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. That silence was its own confession. I walked them through the house, each room glowing with the evidence of my sweat and labor, the patched beams, the refinished floors, the dock I rebuilt board by board. "This isn't just a house," I told them. "It's the proof that I exist, and you tried to hand it away like it was a party favor." My mother's eyes shimmered, not with the old performance but with something real this time. Regret. My father finally muttered, "We were wrong." The words hung in the air heavy and late, but still, something. I didn't forgive them, not fully, not yet. Some wounds aren't stitched in a day. But as they left, shoulders bent under the weight of their choices, I realized their reckoning had already begun. Not because I punished them, but because they had to live with the truth of who they were, and how the world now saw them, and that, I thought, was the sharpest revenge of all, letting them be haunted by their own reflection. But in the weeks that followed, the lake house grew quieter, not with loneliness but with peace, a kind of peace I hadn't felt since before the storm broke. The water mirrored the sky each morning, blue upon blue, and at night the stars returned, scattered like forgiveness I didn't owe anyone. My parents stopped calling. My sister disappeared into her own debts, her silence louder than her tantrums had ever been. And me, I stayed. I stayed in the house I fought for, the house that carried every scar of my labor, and every echo of my defiance. One evening I sat on the dock, the wood warm beneath me, and realized the revenge was never about humiliating them, never about taking something back. It was about refusing to let them rewrite me. They called me cruel. They called me selfish. But the truth was simpler. I had finally chosen myself. The poetic justice wasn't in their exile, or their shame, or their fractured pride. It was in the stillness of that lake, the roof over my head, the walls that held me. It was in the fact that, after all their schemes and promises, the house stood exactly where I put it. And I stood exactly where I belonged. And as the wind stirred the water and the moon carved a silver path across the waves, I whispered into the night like it was a microphone, a story sent out into the dark. They tried to take my life and gift it away. I said no. And no was enough. Ja 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 ja.